They said Adrian Blackthorne never knelt for anyone. They were right, until the night he destroyed the one person who had been quietly holding his empire together with bare hands. The grand banquet of Ashford Hall. 500 nobles watching. Candlelight catching every expression like a court painter paid to record the moment for posterity. And there she was, Duchess Evelyn, 8 months pregnant, lowering herself to her knees on cold marble because her husband said nothing to stop it. The kingdom saw a disgraced duchess. What they missed was a woman making her final decision. Stay until the end, because what comes after silence is always the louder thing. Shank. The banquet had been Adrian's idea. That was the first fact Evelyn held in her mind as the carriage rolled through the iron gates of the capital and the torchlight of Ashford Hall came into view against the winter sky. A great pale structure burning with warmth from every window, designed to signal power the way all things Adrian built were designed to signal power. Without warmth, without invitation, simply as statement. He wanted this, she thought. He planned the guest list. He chose the date. She had dressed accordingly. The gown was midnight blue, high-waisted to accommodate the child pressing steadily against her ribs, the bodice embroidered with the blackthorn crest in silver thread. A detail she had added herself, quietly, because she understood the politics of appearance better than her husband had ever credited her for. 8 months into a pregnancy that had been, from the beginning, a private siege of exhaustion and fear and a loneliness she did not discuss with anyone, Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne looked precisely as a duchess ought to look, composed, unhurried, entirely at ease with the world. She was none of those things. The child kicked once, low and hard, as the carriage door opened and the footman extended his hand. She took it. She stepped down onto the stone drive. She arranged her expression. Inside, the hall was already full. 500 guests was not a figure of speech. Ashford Hall's main gallery stretched the full length of the east wing, and Adrian had filled it. Earls and viscounts and the younger sons of ancient families, their wives draped in silk imported from countries Evelyn had helped negotiate trade agreements with, their jewels refracting the chandelier light into small cold fires. The room smelled of perfume and warm candle wax, and the particular pressure of people performing for one another. Evelyn had grown up in rooms like this. She knew how to read them the way sailors read water, by the quality of stillness, by what wasn't moving. Several things weren't moving. Lady Isolde Crane stood near the fireplace on the far side of the room with 3 women Evelyn recognized as belonging to her particular orbit, wives of the men on the interior council, positioned exactly where they could see both the main entrance and the Duke's raised platform at the head of the hall. Isolde herself was 26, recently widowed, currently pressing a very deliberate social campaign to position herself as indispensable to the court. She had been at 4 of the last 6 functions Evelyn had attended. At 2 of them, she had been standing within easy conversation distance of Adrian. Evelyn had noticed. She had said nothing. Adrian was already at the head of the hall, standing rather than seated, and that alone told her something. He never stood to receive guests at his own events. He stood when he wanted height. He stood when he was performing authority rather than simply exercising it. He was in conversation with Lord Harwick and 2 men Evelyn didn't immediately recognize, and he did not look toward the entrance when she came through it. She found her place at the table. She exchanged greetings with the Countess of Murfield on her left, asked after the woman's daughter, listened to the answer. She accepted a glass of water from a footman and pressed it briefly against her wrist beneath the tablecloth, where the pulse was running too fast for a woman who was simply attending a dinner. Get through the evening, she told herself, that's all. The trouble, when it came, arrived with the second course. She should have seen it. Months later, turning the night over and over in the sleepless hours before dawn, she would identify the precise moment where she might have intervened. The particular angle of Isolde's smile, the way the 3 women near her shifted when the soup was cleared, the fact that Lord Harwick had moved his seat during the first course and was now positioned 2 chairs closer to Adrian than he had been at the start of the meal. The geometry of the thing had been drawn in advance. She had simply been too tired to read it in time. Isolde rose. It was casual enough. A woman standing to reposition herself, to speak to someone. Nothing that would draw the room's attention. But she didn't move toward her companions. She moved to the center of the gallery, and she spoke in a voice calibrated for exactly the room she was standing in. Not a shout, not a whisper, but the clear, carrying tone of someone who had rehearsed. "It has come to our attention," Isolde said, "that the Duchess of Blackthorn has been conducting private correspondence with the Varamont family." The room didn't go silent immediately. That was the particular horror of it. The silence came in waves, rippling outward from the women closest to Isolde, spreading table by table until it reached the corners of the hall, and then the gallery was completely, utterly, terribly quiet. Evelyn set down her glass. She did it slowly, deliberately, keeping her hand steady through an act of will that cost her more than anyone watching could have known. The child moved. She pressed her palm flat against the tablecloth. "The Varamont family," Isolde continued, as though completing a thought she'd begun in polite conversation, "as this court is well aware, has been under investigation by the Crown for the past 14 months on charges of financing insurrection against the duchy. Correspondence with this family, conducted secretly and without the knowledge of the Duke, constitutes at minimum a breach of household trust, and at maximum, collaboration with enemies of the Blackthorn bloodline." Evelyn looked at Adrian. He was already looking at her. That was the thing she had not expected. Not his silence, not the angle of his jaw, not the cold calculation she had learned to read in his eyes over 3 years of marriage. She had expected all of that. What she had not expected was that his face, in the moment their gazes met across the length of the hall, would show nothing, not anger, not denial, not even the courtesy of confusion. Nothing. 3 years of marriage, and she had believed, she had constructed an entire interior architecture of belief around the idea that whatever else Adrian Blackthorn was, whatever cruelties his position had carved into him, he knew her well enough for nothing to be impossible between them. She had built her understanding of the marriage on that single brick, and in the space of one exchanged glance across a banquet hall, she felt it pull away from under everything. She turned back to Isolde. "I have corresponded with Helena Varamont," Evelyn said. Her voice came out level. She hadn't known it would, but it did. "Helena Varamont, who is 63 years old, and was my mother's closest companion for 30 years before her family was implicated in your investigation. I wrote to offer her condolences on the difficulty of her situation. I wrote 4 letters across the span of 8 months. I have copies of every one of them." Isolde's expression did not change. She had expected a defense. A defense was not a problem. "The Duchess's personal sympathies," Isolde said, turning slightly so she was addressing the room rather than Evelyn, "are not in question. What is in question is the judgment and the discretion of a woman in a position of such trust, conducting private communication with a family under Crown investigation without informing her husband. The Duke of Blackthorn has built this duchy on the principle that loyalty is not approximate, that it is either complete or it is nothing." She let the word nothing sit in the air. Then she said quietly, which was worse than anything she'd said before, "We thought he should know." What happened next, Evelyn would replay for the rest of her life, with the flat, exhausted persistence of someone trying to find the frame where a different outcome was still possible. Lord Harwick spoke. He said it was a grave matter. He said the court required clarity. He said, and here his gaze moved to Adrian with the particular quality of a man who had been practicing his expression, that the duchy's enemies were known to use the women of powerful men as channels of influence, and that no accusation of this nature could be allowed to go unaddressed before the assembled nobility. Adrian said nothing. He simply looked at Evelyn. And then Lord Harwick said the words that she realized, even as they were spoken, had been the point of the entire evening. The protocol of the court requires that an accused party answer directly to the Duke, before witnesses, on their knees, if the accusation concerns the integrity of the house. She heard several things at once, the whisper moving through the gallery like wind over water, the Countess of Murfield beside her drawing a sharp breath, the sound of her own heartbeat in the specific hollow behind her ears that she associated with extreme cold. She looked at Adrian again. He was still looking at her, still nothing. And that nothing, she understood now, was its own kind of answer. It was the answer of a man who had already decided, or who had been told what to decide, or who did not care enough about the difference between those two things to examine which was true. Evelyn stood. She was aware of every eye in the hall. She was aware of the weight of the child, the ache in her lower back that had been constant for 6 weeks, the precise temperature of the marble through the thin soles of her evening shoes. She walked the length of the gallery without hurrying. She passed Lord Harwick. She passed Isolde, who had the grace, or the calculation, to not smile. She stopped in front of the raised platform where Adrian stood, and then, in front of 500 people, Eveline Blackthorne lowered herself to her knees. It was not a dramatic gesture. That was the thing that broke something in several of the older women watching. It wasn't theatrical or anguished. It was simply mechanical. A woman's body doing what was required of it, while the woman herself was somewhere else entirely. She did not cry. She did not look at anyone. She kept her eyes on the floor in front of her husband's feet, and she said, in a voice clear enough to carry to the back of the gallery, "I apologize to the Duke of Blackthorne and to this court for any correspondence that caused concern. It was not my intention to act in any way counter to the interests of this house or to my husband's trust." The room remained quiet. Adrian looked down at her. He said nothing. He extended his hand after a moment, and a footman stepped forward to help her rise because the Duke of Blackthorne had decided that was sufficient, and what the Duke of Blackthorne decided was what happened in his house. Eveline rose without taking the footman's hand. She stood. She turned and walked back to her seat, and she sat down, and she picked up her glass of water, and she drank from it. She did not look at Adrian again for the remainder of the evening. The carriage ride home was completely silent. Adrian sat across from her with his forearms resting on his knees and his gaze directed somewhere past her left shoulder toward the dark beyond the carriage window. He had drunk significantly at the banquet. She could tell not from any slurring or imbalance, but from the particular stillness that settled over him when alcohol had reached the layer of him where emotion lived. He became more contained when he drank, not less. It was one of the things she had once thought was discipline, before she'd understood it was the opposite. A man sealing himself against himself. "The Veramont letters," he said. She looked at him. What about them? Were there more than 4? No. Did they concern anything beyond personal condolences? No. He nodded once, slowly, as though logging the information somewhere internal and administrative. The carriage moved through the dark. Rain had begun. Light, cold, tapping against the roof with the particular rhythm of early winter. "You should have told me," he said. Eveline felt the response rise in her and held it back. She was very good at holding things back. 3 years of marriage to Adrian Blackthorne had given her a particular musculature for it, the ability to receive the unbearable and keep her face neutral, to store it somewhere it wouldn't show until she was alone. "Yes," she said, "that's not—" He stopped himself. "That's not what?" she asked, and she was surprised to find she actually wanted to know. Even now, that was the humiliating part. Even now, with the bruise of the marble on her knees and the phantom weight of 500 pairs of eyes, she wanted to know what he'd been about to say. Adrian looked at her. For a moment, something moved in his face. Something that might have been the beginning of an apology, or might have been anger, or might have been something she didn't have a word for. And then it closed again, the way she'd seen him close things, the particular efficient manner he had of eliminating whatever was inconvenient. "Get some rest," he said. She turned toward the window. The rain was heavier now. She watched it track down the glass, and she thought very clearly, without grief, without rage, simply as a fact she was finally allowing herself to know, he will not change. This is who he is. And I've been spending 3 years trying to love a man who has already decided what is important, and I am not on the list. She pressed her hand against the curve of her stomach where the child was quiet. Finally, the kicking stilled into the peculiar, watchful stillness of late pregnancy. "I'll get you out," she thought. "I promise." She did not sleep. The Blackthorne mansion was 40 rooms across 3 wings, and at 2 in the morning it was entirely silent in the specific way of very large houses. A silence that wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of weight, old stone, holding its breath. Eveline sat at the writing desk in her dressing room in her nightgown with the single lamp burning and 4 letters spread in front of her that had nothing to do with Helena Veramont. The first was from Margaret Ashford, her cousin, now living in the country house at Dunmore, 3 hours by fast carriage, 6 in weather like this. Margaret had offered twice in the last year to take her in. She had refused twice. The second was a record of the private account Eveline had been maintaining at a merchant bank in the lower city for 14 months, in her maiden name, with funds accumulated from the quarterly household allowance Adrian authorized but never monitored because he had not yet understood that silence doesn't mean contentment, it means calculation. The third was a letter she had written 2 weeks ago and not sent, addressed to the midwife in Dunmore, asking whether she could accommodate a birth on short notice. The fourth was blank. She stared at the blank page for a long time. The rain outside had settled into a steady pour, steady and indifferent, the kind of rain that doesn't know what it's falling on. She had spent 3 years in this house. She had managed the household accounts, the staff, the maintenance of the ducal properties. She had attended every political function, learned every significant alliance and enmity in the court, cultivated relationships with the wives of powerful men whose goodwill had proven useful to Adrian on 6 separate occasions that she had engineered quietly enough that he'd believed each one was his own doing. She had read every document he gave her, and several he didn't. She had learned the names of his enemies before he'd thought to tell her he had enemies. She had done all of this while falling in love with a man who had looked at her kneeling on marble tonight and decided that was an acceptable use of his wife. She picked up the pen. She began to write. Dear Margaret, I will need Dunmore by the end of the month. I will explain when I arrive. Please tell no one, not because I am afraid of Adrian learning I am coming, but because I need some days of quiet before the child arrives and I cannot have them if the family descends. I am well. The baby is well. These are the 2 facts that matter most, and they are both true, which means everything else is a problem I can solve. I will see you soon. She folded the letter and sealed it. She set it aside. She sat very still for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she pulled the blank page toward her and wrote a second letter, shorter, more careful, addressed not to anyone but serving as a record for herself of everything she knew. The names, the dates, the structure of the conspiracy she had been tracking for 11 months, ever since she'd intercepted a communication meant for Adrian that had been routed incorrectly through the household correspondence and had wound up on her desk, and which she had spent the months since quietly, methodically investigating rather than alarming anyone before she understood the full shape of what she was looking at. The Veramont accusation was not about Helena Veramont. Eveline had understood that within 30 seconds of Isolde opening her mouth. Helena Veramont's family had been implicated in a Crown investigation, yes. But the investigation itself, its origin, its direction, the specific set of charges that had been constructed against a 70-year-old trading family with no history of political activity that had been engineered. By whom, and to what end, she had been trying to determine precisely before acting. Tonight had forced her hand. The accusation against her was not a spontaneous eruption of court politics. It was a second move in a game that had begun 11 months ago with a misdirected letter, and the purpose of the game was not to damage Eveline Blackthorne, but to destabilize the Duke, to introduce enough poison into the space between a man and his wife that he would make errors, would act on bad information, would eventually be maneuvered into a political position from which his duchy could not recover. She had been protecting him. She had been protecting him for the better part of a year, quietly, without his knowledge, without his gratitude, without even his awareness that there was anything to protect him from. And tonight he had watched her kneel. She folded the second letter differently and sealed it separately, and wrote on the outside of it, in her clearest hand, for Adrian Blackthorne, to be opened in the event of my death or permanent absence. She set it in the back of the desk drawer behind the household correspondence, where it would be found eventually by anyone who went looking, but not immediately by anyone who did not. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a long time. The child moved. Once, twice, a heel or a fist pressing against the curve of her ribs with the insistent, utterly indifferent urgency of new life that doesn't know yet what world it's coming into and is already trying to get there regardless. I know, she whispered. I know. She was almost composed by morning. The household came alive at 6. She heard the staff below, the kitchen fires, the particular sounds of the mansion resuming its daily operations with the efficiency she had organized and maintained. She dressed without her lady's maid, a skill she'd practiced in the last weeks, and came down to the breakfast room early. Adrian was already there. He was in riding clothes, which meant he'd arranged an early departure somewhere. and he was standing with his back to the door, looking out the window at the grounds, a cup of coffee in his hand, his posture that of a man in complete possession of his space and entirely undisturbed by the events of the previous night. He looked, Evelyn thought, exactly like what he was, a man who had organized the world around himself so precisely that nothing in it was capable of actually reaching him. She sat down. A footman poured her tea. She drank it. "I'm going to Harwick's estate this morning," Adrian said without turning. "Back by Thursday." "Fine," she said. A pause. He turned then, not because she'd said anything that required a response, but because something in the quality of the word had apparently reached him. He looked at her with the particular attention he sometimes directed at things he didn't understand, the slight narrowing of those dark eyes that she had once found compelling, the focused weight of a man who took everything seriously. "Evelyn?" "Have a safe ride," she said. She looked at the window. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary. She was aware of it, the fraction of time where something uncharacteristic might happen, where the previous evening might be addressed as something other than a closed file. She did not look at him. She drank her tea. She thought about Dunmore and the road there and how quickly she could move when she needed to move. He set down his coffee cup and left the room. She heard his boots on the marble of the entry hall. She heard the front door. She heard the horses in the courtyard, the sound of the groom, the instructions given. All the ordinary sounds of Adrian Blackthorne organizing his departure with the smooth, unhesitating efficiency of a man who had never in his life considered that his arrangements might have consequences he couldn't simply ride away from. Then silence. Evelyn set down her teacup. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she rose, went to the writing room, and began making the arrangements in earnest. She had 3 weeks. That was her estimate, though she ran the numbers twice to be certain. 3 weeks before the child would come. The midwife had said late month, possibly earlier given the way the baby had been sitting for the past 2 weeks. 3 weeks before she would be physically unable to travel. She needed to be at Dunmore before that, needed to have the establishment already arranged and the household staff there briefed and the access to the private account confirmed, because the single thing she would not do was have this child in a house where she no longer trusted the man who owned it. She was not afraid of Adrian. She needed to be precise about that, even in her own mind, because she had seen what fear did to women in this court, and she refused the shape of it. She was not afraid of him. She was finished with him. And that was a different and, in some ways, more devastating thing, because fear could be waited out, but the decision she had made in the carriage last night, in the particular stillness that comes after a long patience finally runs out, did not have a reversal built into it. She sent Margaret's letter with a trusted courier by noon. She requested a meeting that afternoon with the household steward under the pretense of reviewing the seasonal supply orders, and she spent 45 minutes learning which of the staff were directly loyal to Adrian and which were loyal to the position of the household, a distinction she had been cultivating carefully for a year because she had understood for a long time, longer than she'd admitted to herself, that she might need to know the difference. She wrote to the midwife in Dunmore. She began the quiet, methodical process of moving the things that mattered to her. Letters, documents, a small number of objects from her childhood that had traveled with her into the marriage, into the secondary storage trunk in her dressing room, the one the maids rarely accessed, not packing, not yet, simply positioning. She was very calm. That was the thing she would remember afterward about those first days. The extraordinary, almost clinical calm of a woman who had made an irrevocable decision and was now simply executing it. Grief would come later. She was certain of that. She wasn't composed because she didn't feel anything, but because grief, like everything else, had its time, and this wasn't it. This time was for precision, for thinking clearly, for making sure that when she left without leaving any piece of herself behind that could be used against her. On the second day, she went to the piano. The Blackthorne music room was on the second floor of the south wing, a long, beautiful space with tall windows and pale walls that caught the afternoon light in a way that had genuinely surprised her when she'd first seen it, because nothing else in the mansion was designed to catch light. Adrian didn't play. He had never asked her to play. But she had found her way to the piano in the first weeks of the marriage the way you find your way to the only room in a house where the air is actually breathable, and she had played nearly every evening since. She sat down. She placed her hands on the keys and did not play for a long time. simply sat with the weight of her hands on the ivory, the familiar geography of it, the way a specific sequence of tones could hold more meaning than a year of carefully chosen words. Then she played. She played through the entirety of the piece she had been practicing since summer, a long, difficult composition she had never quite gotten right, and she got it right now, with the rain outside and the house empty and nobody listening, playing it through from beginning to end without stopping, without error, without hesitation. She finished. She sat in the silence after. She closed the piano. She didn't know it would be the last time. Thursday came and went without Adrian. He sent a message Friday morning, brief, administrative, the handwriting of his personal secretary rather than his own hand, stating that his business at Harwick's estate required 2 additional days and that he would return by Sunday. She acknowledged the message through the household steward without comment. She continued her preparations. On Saturday, she made her final error of judgment. She had decided to visit the Blackthorn County Records Office in the lower district, a trip she had made 6 times in the past year in the course of her investigation, and which attracted no particular attention given her role in managing the ducal properties. She went in the afternoon with 1 footman and the older of the 2 carriage drivers she trusted. She spent an hour in the records room confirming the final piece of information she needed: the name of the 3rd investor in the consortium that had funded the Vermont investigation's construction. She found it. The name was Lord Harwick. She sat with that knowledge for exactly 90 seconds, organizing its implications, and then she collected her papers and left. She was nearly to the carriage when she saw Lady Isolde Crane. Isolde was emerging from the milliner's shop across the street. She had clearly not expected to see the Duchess, and the flicker of recalibration on her face was brief but visible to anyone who knew how to look. She recovered quickly, as she always did, and she crossed the street with the smooth, deliberate grace of a woman choosing her approach. "Your Grace," she said, "you look remarkably well, considering." "Lady Crane," Evelyn said, "I hope there are no hard feelings about the other night." Isolde's tone was perfectly calibrated, the precise frequency of social sincerity. "These things must be addressed publicly. The court requires it. I'm sure you understand." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about the 11 months of documentation in the locked drawer of her writing desk. She thought about the name she had just confirmed from the county records. She thought about a 63-year-old woman whose family had been systematically destroyed as part of a larger architecture of manufactured pressure, and about the 4 letters she had written in good faith, and about the use those letters had been put to. She thought about Adrian, watching her kneel. "I understand a great many things, Lady Crane," she said. Her voice was very calm. "I suspect more than you've credited me for." Isolde's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but in the way of someone recalculating a risk assessment. "Enjoy your afternoon," Evelyn said, and turned to the carriage. She was halfway to the door when Isolde said behind her, softly enough that the footman couldn't hear, "You should leave while you still can, Your Grace, before the next part of this becomes something you won't be able to walk away from so gracefully." Evelyn's hand was on the carriage door. She did not turn around. "I intend to," she said, and she got in. The carriage was 2 streets from the mansion when the driver's pace changed. It was subtle, a slight slowing, a deviation from the usual route, the kind of adjustment that meant traffic or a fallen branch or any number of ordinary things. She almost didn't notice. She was looking at the papers in her hands, rereading the record of the Harwick investment, organizing the sequence of it in her mind. Then the carriage stopped entirely. She heard the driver's voice. One short phrase, she couldn't make out the words. Then silence. Then the door opened, and it was not the footman. It was a man she didn't recognize. He was not in livery. He was in the dark clothing of someone who had dressed specifically to attract no attention, and he stood in the carriage doorway with the controlled stillness of a person who was very comfortable with intimidation. And he said, "The Duchess of Blackthorn. We need to have a conversation." The child kicked hard, once, a movement so forceful she felt it at the base of her spine. She looked at the man in her carriage door and she understood, with perfect crystalline clarity, that the warning Isolde had given her 6 minutes ago had not been a threat. It had been a timeline. The man in the carriage doorway had the particular stillness of someone who had done this before. Not restless, not performing threat, simply present in the way of a tool held ready, patient, specific, entirely indifferent to what she was feeling. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders with the weathered complexion of someone who spent significant time outdoors doing things that required discretion. His hands were visible, both of them. That was deliberate, she understood. A calculated display of non-aggression designed to keep her calm long enough for whatever came next. "Move back, please," he said. "Give me room to sit." Evelyn did not move. "Where's my driver?" she said. "Your driver is fine. He'll be compensated for his inconvenience." The man's voice was uninflected, regional, not the capital, somewhere north, the vowels slightly flattened. He'd been educated after he'd grown up, which meant he'd been recruited rather than born into whatever this was. "I'm not here to hurt you, Your Grace. I'm here to deliver a message." "Then deliver it from there." Something moved in his face, not quite amusement, more like a professional acknowledgement that she wasn't going to be easy. He stayed in the doorway. Behind him she could see the street, which was wrong. They were in a narrow side passage she didn't recognize, not a main road, somewhere between the Records District and the Merchant Quarter, chosen for the same reason everything tonight had been chosen, so that nothing that happened here would have witnesses. "The people I work for want you to understand something," he said. "What happened at the banquet? That was a courtesy. That was them giving the Duchess of Blackthorn an opportunity to step away gracefully before the situation required less graceful options." "What situation?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You've been in the county records office 6 times in the past year. You've been building something. They want to know how much you know and what you intend to do with it." The child was very still. That happened sometimes. The baby would go quiet for an hour, 2 hours, and she would press her hand against her side and wait, and eventually movement would come back, and she would breathe again. She pressed her hand against her side now, not for reassurance, but as an anchor, something to orient against while she calculated. "I manage the ducal properties," she said. "The county records are a routine resource. 6 visits in 12 months to the title record specifically is not routine." He tilted his head slightly. "The people I work for are not asking you to stop, Your Grace. They're asking you to share. Whatever you found, they'd like to see it before the Duke does." "And if I decline?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering the most efficient phrasing. "Then the next conversation will involve parties less interested in being courteous." Evelyn looked at him. She had been afraid twice in the last year, genuinely, physically afraid, the kind that lived in the body rather than the mind. The first time was the night she'd read the misdirected letter and understood what it implied. The second was 2 minutes ago, when this man had opened her door. But she had been afraid at both of those moments, and had not acted like it, because she had learned early that fear performed was fear weaponized against you, that the moment you gave someone the shape of your fear, they owned a tool they hadn't had before. "Tell your employers," she said, "that the Duchess of Blackthorn keeps meticulous records. Tell them that those records are not housed in the Blackthorn mansion. Tell them that if anything happens to me or to anyone in my household, those records reach the Crown before the week is out." She held his gaze. That should give them something useful to consider. He studied her. The professional calm in his face didn't break, but something behind it recalibrated. A small, barely visible shift of a man reassessing whether he'd been given accurate information about his target. "You're bluffing," he said. "I'm informing," she said. "There's a difference. You can decide what you believe." A long silence. Then he stepped back from the door. "Think carefully about your next few days, Your Grace," he said. "The people I represent are not unkind to women in your condition, but their patience has a limit." He closed the door. She heard voices outside, brief, low, and then the carriage resumed movement, the driver's seat occupied again, the route correcting back toward the mansion. She sat with both hands flat on the seat beside her and breathed through the next 3 minutes without moving, without allowing herself to process anything until the shaking in her hands had stopped. It stopped by the time they reached the mansion gates. Good, she thought. Good. She sent for no one that evening. She dismissed her lady's maid early, closed the dressing room door, and sat at the writing desk with the lamp turned high, and every document she'd assembled over 11 months spread in front of her in the particular order she'd developed for reviewing them. Chronological within each thread, cross-referenced by name, the Harwick connection at the center like a hub from which everything else radiated. It was worse than she'd wanted it to be. Harwick was the investor and the political architect, but the carriage encounter this afternoon had revealed something she hadn't fully mapped yet. There was an operational layer beneath the political one, a set of people who did the work the nobles couldn't be seen doing. The man in her carriage was not Harwick's personal servant. He was a professional, which meant money, organization, and a degree of premeditation that made the Veramont accusation look less like an improvised social maneuver and more like one movement in a sequence that had been planned considerably further ahead than she'd assumed. She pulled a blank page and began writing. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote the complete architecture of what she knew, not summarized, not abbreviated, but in the full technical detail of someone who understood that the value of a document was its specificity. Every name, every date, every financial connection she'd traced through the county records, the misdirected letter transcribed verbatim from memory, the Veramont investment structure, Harwick's secondary holdings that created the financial motive, the 6-month timeline of social positioning by Isolde Crane and her circle, the pattern of manufactured access to Adrian, the dinners, the council meetings, the gradual erosion of the buffer Eveline had maintained between her husband and the people who wished him harm. When she was done, she read it through twice. Then she wrote a second copy. The first she sealed and added to the desk drawer behind the letter she'd already placed there. The second she wrapped separately, addressed it in a hand that could not be identified as hers, and set it with the letters going out by courier tomorrow morning. Not to Margaret, not to the Crown, but to a particular barrister in the Eastern District who had been her father's attorney and who had, she knew, the specific quality of loyalty that comes from being well paid and long trusted. She was bluffing about one thing. She hadn't sent the records yet. She had not been bluffing about the rest. But Adrian came back Sunday as promised. She heard the horses at dusk, heard his voice in the entrance hall, curt, functional, the few words he gave the staff when he was tired or when something had not gone as expected. She was in the sitting room off the main staircase with a book she hadn't read a word of, and she heard him come up the stairs and go directly to his study without stopping, which was what he did when he needed to decompress from whatever had accumulated over a few days away. She waited 20 minutes. Then she went to the study. He was at his desk with a glass of whiskey and a stack of correspondence he'd clearly just begun working through. He looked up when she came in. The particular quality of his attention, that weight she'd once wanted aimed at her, now just felt like being assessed. She closed the door behind her. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. Force of habit, she thought. He managed people by controlling the geometry of rooms, always had. "I'll stand," she said. He set down his pen. He looked at her with the focused stillness that meant he'd registered that this was not a routine conversation. "While you were at Harwick's estate," she said, "were you there the entire time?" A beat. "What kind of question is that?" "The straightforward kind." "Yes," he said. "I was there the entire time." "Why?" "I want you to think carefully about everything Harwick said to you over those 4 days. Every political discussion, every opinion he offered about this household, about your council, about me." Adrian's jaw moved. Not quite a clench, the near equivalent in a man who controlled his face. "Evelyn, I was stopped yesterday," she said. "My carriage. A man I didn't know opened the door and told me that people he works for wanted to know how much I'd learned from the county records. He told me the banquet was a courtesy warning and that the next conversation would be less courteous." The silence in the study had a different quality now. Adrian was very still. "He was a professional," she continued. "Not household staff, not a political errand boy. Someone who does this specifically. He knew about my 6 visits to the records office. He knew what I'd been looking at." She watched Adrian's face. "Someone told him those details. Someone with enough access to the right information to give it to the right people. You're saying Harwick. I'm saying I don't know the full structure yet, but Harwick is part of it. I have documentation, 11 months of it." Adrian stood up. He crossed the room in 4 steps, not toward her, toward the window, and she recognized the movement as him needing to do something with his body while he processed information that was reorganizing too many things at once. He stood with his back to her, and one hand pressed flat against the window frame, and she watched the line of his shoulders. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because I needed to be certain before I gave you something to act on," she said. "You don't operate on uncertainty. I've watched you for 3 years. You act on complete information, or you don't act at all, and if I'd brought you a theory 11 months ago, you'd have confronted Harwick with something that wasn't ready, and we'd have lost the advantage. And now? Now I have documentation. Now I know the structure." A pause. "Now someone has also shown their hand by stopping my carriage, which means whatever timeline they were working on has compressed. They know I'm close to finished." He turned from the window. She had expected anger, the cold, controlled kind that Adrian deployed rather than erupted, the measured fury of a man who'd learned to use his temper as precision instrument. But what was on his face was something else, and she stood very still in the middle of the room looking at it because she had not seen it before. It looked very faintly like fear, not for himself. "You've been carrying this alone," he said. "Yes." "For 11 months. "Yes." He stared at her. The fear moved through his face and was followed, as things always were with Adrian, by the machine of him re-engaging, the assessment, the tactical mind, the closing down of whatever had opened briefly into something human. "I need to see the documentation," he said. And there it was. Not, "I'm sorry you were stopped on a public street while carrying my child." Not, "I should have protected you." Not even the acknowledgation of what had happened 5 days ago at the banquet, which stood between them in the room as clearly as a third person, and which he was stepping around with the practiced ease of a man who had decided that some things, once done, were better left unaddressed. Not "why didn't you tell me" as guilt, as information request. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll have it for you tomorrow," she said. "Tonight." "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I'm going to sleep." She turned and left the study. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand still on the door handle, the wood solid and cool under her fingers, the dark of the hall around her, the sounds of the house below. And she understood, with the clean, flat finality of something that has been approaching for a long time and has finally arrived, that she had just made her last genuine effort. She had offered him the truth. He had processed it as data. She had offered him her protection, carried alone for nearly a year, and he had said tonight, there was nothing more she was willing to give, also. She did not bring him the documentation in the morning. She spent 3 days in the normal rhythm of the house: breakfast, household management, the afternoon rest the midwife had insisted on for the last month of the pregnancy, evenings in the sitting room or the library. Adrian moved around her with the careful, slightly altered energy of a man who was thinking about something he hadn't finished processing. And twice she caught him watching her from across a room with an expression she chose, deliberately, not to read. It was too late for expressions. She finished her preparations. On Wednesday morning, she received a response from Margaret, brief, warm, practical. "The East Wing is ready. Come when you need to come. I'll tell no one." That evening, she wrote the final version of her departure letter. Not to Adrian. She had already written what she needed him to know and sealed it in the desk drawer. This letter was to the household steward, informing him that the Duchess would be traveling to Dunmore for the remainder of her confinement and requesting that a carriage be made ready for Thursday morning. She sealed it. She set it on the desk for delivery in the morning. She went to bed. At 2 in the morning, she lay awake listening to the rain, heavier tonight, full winter weight. And she thought about the piano in the music room and the specific light on winter afternoons in the South Wing, and she let herself feel all of it once, fully, with nothing held back, the grief and the waste and the specific cruelty of loving someone who had never understood that love was not a fact about him, but a sustained choice on someone else's part. She let herself feel it, and then she put it down. She was nearly asleep when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Not staff. Wrong hour, wrong rhythm. These were quick, and when they stopped at her door, there was a short, hard knock, not a servant's knock. She sat up. "Come in," she said. It was Adrian's personal secretary, Whitmore, a man in his 50s who had been with the household for 12 years and whose composure she had never seen break. His composure was broken now. "Your Grace," he said, "I apologize for the hour." His voice had the quality of someone keeping it level through effort. The Duke's office received a message by urgent courier 20 minutes ago. What message? There's been a development with the Interior Council. He paused, and the pause was its own information. Whitmore did not pause. 2 members of the Duke's Council have presented formal charges to the Crown against His Grace. Another pause. The charges include financial fraud in the Duchy's northern trade agreements and conspiracy to undermine Crown authority. The room was very still. These are fabricated, Eveline said. Yes, Your Grace. We believe so. Where's the Duke? He received the message at the same time. He's in his study. He has been... Whitmore stopped. He pressed his lips together. He said very carefully, he has been given until Friday to appear before the Crown's inquiry and present a defense. Friday. 48 hours. Eveline sat in the dark of her bedroom with the rain against the windows and the whole shape of it arriving at once. The banquet, the carriage, the careful long game of it, the way every piece had been positioned so that when it closed from every direction simultaneously. Harwick had not been building a case against the Duchess. He'd been building a case against the Duke, using the Duchess as the lever to isolate him, discredit his household, and manufacture the political distance that made formal charges survivable. The documentation in her desk drawer. The documentation she had been building for 11 months. The documentation that could dismantle every charge currently sitting on Adrian Blackthorne's name if it reached the right hands in the next 48 hours. She threw back the covers and stood. Tell the Duke I need to see him immediately, she said, and tell the stable to prepare the fastest carriage we have. I need it at the south door in 1 hour. Whitmore stared at her. Your Grace, the physician said you shouldn't... 1 hour, she said. Go. He went. She dressed alone in the dark, moving quickly and without wasted motion, and the child was awake and pressing against her ribs as though it too understood that something had shifted irrevocably, that the quiet, careful counting of days had just been rendered beside the point, that what came next was not going to be the orderly departure she'd planned. She pulled the sealed letter from the desk drawer. Not the one for the steward, not the personal farewell, but the one she'd written for Adrian, the one she'd labeled for his eyes in the event of my absence. She broke the seal and refolded it and put it in the pocket of her traveling coat. Then she picked up the full documentation file, everything, all of it, 11 months of work, and held it under her arm. She was ready. Adrian was already in the corridor when she opened her door. He was in shirt sleeves, his hair not yet fixed from sleep, the whiskey glass from earlier still in his hand, though empty. He looked at the documentation file under her arm. He looked at her traveling coat. He looked at her face. Whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't say it. I have everything you need to answer those charges, she said. Every financial record, every connection, the full structure of what Harwick has been building for over a year. She held out the file. Take it. Use it. Get ahead of this before Friday. He took the file. He stood in the corridor holding it and looking at her with that expression she had decided not to read. Eveline, he said. I'm leaving for Dunmore in the morning, she said. I was going to leave quietly. That's still what I want. A quiet departure, no confrontation, no scene. I'd like you to respect that. The word leaving landed in the corridor between them like something dropped from height. You can't leave, he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not the controlled chill or the administrative distance, something rougher, something that might have been panic if Adrian Blackthorne were capable of panic. Eveline, the charges? If you leave now, it will look like... I know how it will look, she said. I know precisely how it will look. I've been managing how things look in this household for 3 years. She was very steady. The documentation will protect you. My presence in this house will not add to that protection, and my absence will not diminish it. If you read what I've given you, you'll understand why. I don't want to read it, he said, and the words came out stripped of their usual architecture, raw in a way she recognized as accidental. A man who had intended to say something else, and had said the true thing instead. I want you to tell me what's in it. Sit with me and tell me. Walk me through it. She looked at him. 3 years. The piano. The evenings she'd spent building bridges between him and the people who mattered. The wars she'd fought quietly on his behalf. the particular loneliness of being the person who understood someone completely and was not understood in return. The marble floor. "Good night, Adrian," she said. She went back into her room and closed the door. She heard him stand there. She heard the particular quality of silence that is a person not moving, not accepting what has happened, holding position against the reality of a door that is simply, completely closed. Then she heard his footsteps move away down the corridor. She crossed to the window. The rain was very heavy now, the kind that turns roads to mud and makes the journey to Dunmore twice as long. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and looked at the dark grounds below. She would leave at first light regardless. She was still at the window 20 minutes later when she heard, from the front of the mansion, the sound of horses. Not one horse. Several. Moving fast. She turned from the window. The knock at her door was not Whitmore's knock, and it was not Adrian's. It was short, hard, the knock of someone who did not particularly care whether she was ready. "Your Grace," a voice she didn't recognize. "By order of the Crown's Office of Inquiry, you are requested to accompany us for questioning regarding your correspondence with the Vermont household." Eveline stood very still in the center of her room. The documentation, all of it, was in the corridor in Adrian's hands. She had nothing. She opened the door. There were 4 of them. 2 in the dark uniform of the Crown's inquiry officers, 1 she didn't recognize in civilian dress with the bearing of a senior administrator, and behind all 3, partially obscured by the corridor's shadow, a 4th figure she did recognize. Whitmore. Her husband's secretary of 12 years stood 3 steps back from the inquiry officers, with his hands folded in front of him and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who is prepared for this moment and is now simply enduring it. He did not meet her eyes. That was the tell. Whitmore was a man who looked at everything directly, who had managed the household's most difficult conversations for over a decade without once looking away from the person he was addressing. He was looking at the floor. Eveline understood in the space of a single breath. Not a leak, not a coincidence. Whitmore had been the one who'd told them about the county records visits. He managed her correspondence calendar. He knew every appointment. He had access to everything she moved through the household infrastructure. 11 months of careful, patient investigation, and the man who'd handed her the urgent message 2 hours ago had already known what she was carrying in that file. He'd given her just enough time to give it to Adrian. She turned back to the inquiry officer in front. "It's the middle of the night," she said. "I'm 8 months pregnant." "We're aware, Your Grace. The questioning will be conducted at the inquiry office and should not take long if you cooperate fully. You're welcome to bring a personal attendant." "And if I decline?" The administrator in civilian dress spoke for the first time. An older man, 60s, with the flat effect of someone who had spent a career delivering consequences rather than making decisions. "Declining would constitute obstruction of a Crown inquiry, Your Grace. Given that charges have already been filed against the Duke, obstruction by a household member would complicate his situation considerably." There it was, not a threat aimed at her, a threat aimed at Adrian, delivered through her, which was the architecture of the entire 11 months compressed into a single sentence. She was not the target. She had never been the target. She was the instrument, about the lever, the pressure point, the way you moved a man who couldn't be moved directly. She looked at Whitmore again. He was still studying the floor with the dedicated attention of someone reading something important in the grain of the wood. "I'll need 5 minutes," she said. "Of course." She closed the door. She stood in the center of the room with both hands pressed flat against the sides of her stomach, and she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The technique the midwife had given her for the labor that was still weeks away, repurposed now for a different kind of emergency. The child was awake. She could feel it. Not kicking, just present. That dense, particular weight of late pregnancy that she had come to think of as company of the most fundamental kind. "Think," she told herself. "You have 5 minutes. Use them." Adrian was somewhere in this house with the complete documentation file. The inquiry officers were here for her, which meant they didn't know Adrian had the file yet. Or they did know, and were counting on her absence to give them time to retrieve it from him before he understood what he was holding. She crossed to the writing desk. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and wrote 6 words. "Read the file before they come." She folded it once, wrote Adrian's name on the outside, and went to the door that connected her dressing room to the inner corridor. Not the main corridor where the officers were waiting, the secondary passage the household used for linen and mourning trays. She opened it. The passage was dark and empty. She set the note on the floor just inside the passage where the morning staff would find it first thing, placed a small candlestick on top of it so it wouldn't be missed. It was not enough. It might be nothing. But it was the only move she had. She put on her coat. She picked up her traveling bag, already packed, already positioned near the door, a fact she chose not to explain to the officers when she returned to the corridor. "I'm ready," she said. "Doug." The inquiry office was a severe building in the governmental quarter. Stone, high-ceilinged, built in the previous century for the purpose of making people feel small. At 3 in the morning, it was lit by a fraction of its usual lamps and staffed by a skeleton crew, which told her this had been planned for a specific hour. Not the chaos of a spontaneous action, the precision of something scheduled. They put her in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked onto an interior courtyard. The administrator, he gave his name as Carvel, senior officer of the Crown Inquiry, sat across from her with a folder of papers and a cup of tea he didn't offer to share. The uniformed officers stood near the door. "The Veramont correspondence," Carvel said. "You acknowledged at the banquet that you wrote 4 letters to Helena Veramont over an 8-month period." "Yes." "What was the content of those letters?" "Personal condolences. I've already stated this publicly." "The inquiry requires specifics, Your Grace." He opened his folder. "Specifically, whether any of those letters contained information about the Blackthorn Duchy's northern trade agreements." Evelyn looked at him. "No." "Or about the Duke's relationship with the Interior Council?" "No." "Or about the financial structure of the ducal properties in the border territories?" Something tightened in her chest. Not panic, something colder. These were specific. These were not the vague accusations of a political smear campaign. These were the exact categories of information that, if leaked to the Veramont family during the Crown's investigation of their finances, would have constituted material assistance to a family under inquiry. Someone had constructed a very specific version of what her letters had contained. "Those letters discuss nothing of the kind," she said. "Do you have copies?" "Yes, at the mansion." "We'll need them." "Then send someone for them." Carvel looked at her mildly. "We did, Your Grace, 30 minutes ago. The household steward informed our officers that the letter copies are not in the location you previously indicated." The silence in the room had a physical quality now. Evelyn looked at the wall behind Carvel's head and made herself stay completely still while she absorbed what he'd just told her. The copies were gone. Not misfiled, not misplaced. Gone. Which meant someone in the household had moved them before the officers arrived, or the officers had arrived before Whitmore had indicated they would, or Whitmore. Whitmore, who managed the household filing system. Whitmore, who knew exactly where every document in the mansion was stored. Whitmore, who had been standing 3 steps behind the inquiry officers with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor. 12 years. She had trusted Whitmore for 3 years of her marriage because Adrian had trusted him for 9 years before that, and loyalty of that duration had seemed like its own kind of proof. She had discussed household matters with him. Not the investigation, never directly, but adjacent things, scheduling things. The kind of operational detail that a trusted secretary naturally knew, and he had been using every word. "I would like to send a message to my husband," she said. "That can be arranged after the questioning, Your Grace." "My husband has documentation relevant to this inquiry, documentation that addresses the charges filed against him tonight. I would like him to be made aware that those documents need to be secured immediately." Carvel's expression did not change. "The Duke of Blackthorn has been asked to appear before this inquiry on Friday. If he has relevant documentation, he is welcome to bring it at that time." She stared at him. He looked back at her with the patient, erosive calm of a bureaucratic instrument, not cruel, not satisfied, simply functional. A mechanism doing what it was built to do, indifferent to what it ground. "You understand," she said, "that the charges against the Duke are fabricated. That is a matter for the inquiry to determine. And the charges against me. You are not currently facing formal charges, Your Grace. You are here for questioning. At 3 in the morning. Urgent matters require urgent attention. He turned a page in his folder. The inquiry is also interested in your visits to the county records office over the past year, specifically the title records for the border territories. Can you describe the purpose of those visits? And there it was, the full shape of it, finally visible. They had known about the records visits. They had known about the Vermont letters. They had known the timing of tonight's message delivery to the mansion, and they had moved on her within 2 hours. The only person who had possessed all three of those pieces of information was Whitmore. But Whitmore had been with Adrian for 9 years before she arrived, which meant either Whitmore had been turned in the last year, bought, threatened, recruited, or he had been positioned beside Adrian for a very long time, waiting for exactly the kind of crisis that was currently unfolding, which was a different and substantially worse thing. She looked at Carvel. "I'd like to know," she said carefully, "who filed the original inquiry request that began the investigation of the Vermont family 14 months ago?" Something moved in Carvel's face, very brief, very controlled, but there. "That information is not relevant to Lord Harwick filed it," she said, "or someone acting on his behalf. The Vermont family had no history of political activity before that investigation began. They were targeted specifically because they were connected to my family, and specifically because those connections could later be used to manufacture evidence of divided loyalty." She watched Carvel's face. "You know this. Some part of you knows this. You are a career officer, and you are competent, and competent career officers understand when they are being used as instruments." The room was very still. "Your Grace," Carvel said, "I would recommend concentrating on answering the inquiry's questions rather than speculating about. My husband has the documentation that proves everything I just told you," she said. 11 months of primary source evidence. If that documentation disappears before Friday, if it is taken from him or destroyed or suppressed, then whatever this inquiry produces will be based on fabricated evidence, and you will have spent your career building a case that collapses the moment anyone looks at it honestly. She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to stop the inquiry. I'm asking you to make sure both sides of the evidence reach the same room." A long silence. Carvel closed his folder. "I'll have someone bring you tea," he said. "This may take some time." They kept her until dawn, not continuously questioning, long stretches of waiting, the kind designed to wear down a person's composure through accumulation of discomfort and uncertainty. She sat in the chair, and she breathed through the intervals, and she thought about Dunmore, about the east wing Margaret had prepared, about the particular quality of light in the countryside in winter, the way it came in low and long, and without the capital's gray weight. She thought about the child. The child had been her north point for 8 months, the fixed thing she oriented by when everything else shifted. She had made every decision of the past year with 2 sets of calculations running simultaneously, what was necessary for the duchy and what was survivable for the pregnancy. She had not pushed herself beyond what the second calculation allowed. She had not compromised the first calculation for personal comfort. The balance had been exhausting and precise and entirely invisible to everyone around her, including her husband. At 5 in the morning, a different officer came into the room, younger, uncomfortable, clearly not senior enough to be managing this and aware of it, and told her she was free to go. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what had changed. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked out. The carriage they'd brought her in was gone. She stood on the steps of the inquiry office in the pre-dawn dark with the cold coming off the stone and the capital beginning its first movements around her. Early vendors, lamplighters finishing their rounds, the distant sound of the river markets. And she understood that she needed to decide right now what she did next. The carriage to Dunmore. That was what she'd planned. But Adrian had the documentation, and Whitmore had been inside the household for 12 years, and the inquiry knew about the county records visits, and the letter copies were gone, and there was a particular kind of danger that existed in the next 48 hours that she had not fully mapped because she hadn't known, until tonight, that her husband's closest employee was the seam through which everything had been leaking. She stood on the steps for 3 minutes. Then she flagged down a hired carriage and gave the driver the address of the Blackthorn mansion. The mansion was not quiet when she arrived. Lights in the study, lights in the east corridor. A horse she didn't recognize tied at the front gate alongside 2 of Adrian's own. She went in through the south entrance, past the kitchen staff who had just begun their morning work, and who looked at her with the particular expression of people who know that something significant is happening and are waiting to understand what it means for them. She heard Adrian's voice from the study before she reached the door. Not words, just tone, which was enough. He was very, very controlled, which was the version of him that had always been the most dangerous to be in a room with. The cold fury rather than the hot kind. The kind that made decisions. She opened the study door. Adrian was standing. Across the desk from him sat Lord Harwick. She absorbed this with one flat beat of recognition and filed it. And beside Harwick was a man in the dark civilian dress of a crown official, different from Carvel, senior in bearing, the kind of seniority that comes from proximity to the actual sources of power rather than its administrative machinery. All three men turned when she came in. Harwick's face went through something she'd never seen on him before. He'd always had the smooth social affect of a man entirely comfortable in the role he'd built. Generous, avuncular, the senior ally whose advice was sought and whose company was valued. He'd sat at their table 14 times in 3 years. He'd given her a gift when the pregnancy was announced, a piece of her mother's favorite composer's sheet music, a detail he had no business knowing, which she now understood was not thoughtfulness, but a demonstration of what he knew and how close he'd been paying attention. What moved through his face now was not fear, it was recalculation. "The Duchess," he said. "You've had quite a night." "Lord Harwick," she said. She looked at Adrian. Adrian was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you'd lost and have just located, and there was a quality to it that she put aside because she didn't have the capacity for it right now. "The documentation," she said. "Do you have it?" "I have it. All of it. Everything you gave me." A fractional pause. "And some things I found on my own this morning, once I understood what I was looking for." Harwick shifted in his chair. "Adrian, whatever the Duchess has given you, I want you to understand that context matters. These are complicated political waters, and a man in your position, with charges currently pending, would do well not to act on documents of unknown provenance before— You funded the investigation of Helena Veremont's family," Adrian said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Harwick's expression settled into something harder. "I contributed to a legitimate Crown inquiry. That's a matter of civic—" "You funded the construction of that inquiry," Adrian said. "There's a difference, and my wife has 11 months of documentation showing exactly what the difference looks like." He put both hands flat on the desk. "You have been in this house. You have sat at my table. You advised me on the banquet's guest list. You were there when I decided the evening's protocol." The silence in the room became a different kind. Evelyn watched Harwick understand that the geometry had shifted, that what he'd calculated as a controlled demolition had just become something else entirely, and that the man across the desk from him was not confused or defensive or manageable, but was simply, methodically, taking stock. "Whatever you think you found," Harwick began. "I know what I've found," Adrian said. "The question I'm currently asking myself is why I didn't find it sooner." He didn't look away from Harwick, and the answer to that question is going to keep me awake for a very long time. Evelyn looked at Whitmore's empty chair at the side of the room. "Where is Whitmore?" "Gone," Adrian said. "He left the house approximately 90 minutes ago. I have people looking for him." She nodded. She had expected this. A man who understood his cover was blown would not wait to see what came next. The Crown official, who had been silent through all of this, spoke for the first time. "Duke Blackthorne, I want to be clear that my presence here this morning is as an observer, not a representative of the formal inquiry. I was informed of the situation by a third party and came independently. If the documentation your Duchess has compiled is what you suggest, the appropriate course is to bring it formally before— My wife was taken from this house in the middle of the night," Adrian said, "while carrying our child. For questioning, that lasted until dawn." The controlled quiet of his voice was doing something specific now. It was the tone she associated with the moments before he moved, the stillness just before the decision was made, and the consequence was irreversible. "Before we discuss the appropriate formal course, I want Lord Harwick to explain to me, in this room, exactly who gave the order for that, and exactly who told the inquiry officers where my wife kept her personal correspondence copies." Harwick said nothing. The room held its breath, and then the Crown official said quietly, "Lord Harwick, I think you should answer that. Something went out of Harwick's face. Not dignity. He still had the physical composure of a man who had been powerful for a long time and knew how to maintain the posture of it. But something else went out of him, some interior certainty that he had built his position on, and in its absence he looked for the first time like exactly what he was, a man who had played too long and too far and had just watched the board turn against him. He looked at Evelyn. "You should have left when I told you to," he said. She looked back at him and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not the catharsis of a confrontation long avoided. Simply the flat recognition of a person seeing something they already knew confirmed. "I know," she said. The pain arrived without warning, low, deep, radiating from her back through to the front of her abdomen in a wave that was nothing like the Braxton Hicks contractions of the last several weeks. She knew the difference immediately. Her body knew it, the way bodies know the things they've been preparing for. She pressed her hand against the desk. Adrian was beside her in 3 steps. She didn't see him move. He was simply there, his hand under her arm, his voice in a register she had never heard from him, stripped of its architecture, just urgency, just Evelyn. "What?" "The baby," she said. "It's the baby." She looked up at him, and in his face she saw something break open that she did not have a name for. Some sealed and load-bearing thing giving way all at once, and what was underneath it was not the feared Duke of Blackthorn, not the controlled and armored man who had watched her kneel on marble, not the man who had processed her year of silent protection as an information request. It was just a man who understood, too late, what he was about to lose. "I need to get to Dunmore," she said. "The midwife is there. I need—" "We go now," he said. "Right now, whatever you need." She gripped his arm. The second wave was already coming. Outside the study windows, the capital was fully awake, gray winter light filling the streets. Behind her, in the room she was leaving, Lord Harwick sat in his chair with the Crown official beside him, and the ruin of 11 months of careful construction spread across the desk in her handwriting, and the corridor ahead of her was Adrian's hand under her arm, and his voice telling the household to move, to prepare, to clear the road south, because the Duchess of Blackthorn needed Dunmore now. She had planned to leave quietly. Nothing about this was quiet. Nothing about any of it, she thought, through the tightening grip of pain, had ever been what she planned. But she was leaving. The road to Dunmore was 40 miles of winter. Adrian knew every mile of it. He had ridden it as a boy, had inspected the ducal properties along its length twice a year for the past 6 years, had crossed it in every season and every weather. He knew where it narrowed at the river crossing north of the mill town. He knew where the old bridge took weight poorly in the wet. He knew that in hard rain the last 8 miles turned to something between mud and river, and that the carriage wheels would drag and labor, and that 40 miles became 60 in terms of time. He had not, until this morning, understood how much a road could cost. Evelyn was in the carriage with her cousin's maid. He'd sent ahead by fast rider the moment her first contraction confirmed what her body was already doing, and Margaret had dispatched a woman back down the road to meet them halfway, because Margaret understood logistics the way Evelyn did, which was to say completely and without requiring instructions. The maid sat beside Evelyn and spoke to her in the low, practical cadence of someone who had done this before. Adrian could hear it from the driver's bench where he had positioned himself, not because the driver needed help, but because the inside of the carriage was the one place in the world where he currently had no function, and he could not endure that. He could endure almost anything. He had built a life on that capacity, the ability to absorb loss, disruption, betrayal, and convert it into forward motion. His father had taught him that the hard way, and the duchy had reinforced it, and 11 years of managing men who tested authority in every possible register had turned it into something close to reflex. He could not endure being useless while she was in pain in the carriage behind him. So he drove. The rain was relentless, the heavy, committed kind that doesn't acknowledge its own excess, that simply continues because continuing is what it does. The horses knew the road better than he was giving them credit for, and he let them find their pace rather than pushing, because the one thing he could not afford was a broken wheel on the river crossing with the water this high. You should have seen it sooner. That was the thought that had been running beneath everything since the study, beneath Harwick's face going flat and the Crown official's careful, neutral expression and Evelyn's hand gripping the desk, and her voice saying the baby with the particular controlled quality of a woman managing her own emergency. It had been running under all of it, like a current under ice, cold and constant and without mercy. He had been told. Not directly, not in so many words, but in every way that mattered, he had been given the information. The way she moved through the household, the particular quality of her attention at events he'd thought she was simply attending as a social function. The questions she'd asked about the northern properties that he'd answered and immediately forgotten. The visits to the records office that Whitmore had mentioned and that he had noted and dismissed because Evelyn managed the properties and property management required records, and he had trusted that characterization without interrogating it. He had trusted Whitmore's characterization. He had been sitting next to his wife for 3 years while she quietly took apart a conspiracy that would have destroyed him, and he had watched her kneel on marble in front of 500 people rather than offer her the simple decency of asking first. The carriage lurched over a rut in the road, and he heard her exhale sharply, heard the maid's voice steady and low in response, and he gripped the reins and kept driving. What? They reached Dunmore at midday. Margaret was at the front door before the carriage stopped moving, a small, dark-haired woman in her 40s who shared Evelyn's quality of complete composure under pressure, who directed the footman with the efficiency of a military commander and had the midwife positioned and the east wing prepared and hot water organized before Adrian had climbed down from the driver's bench. She looked at him once, a single, level assessment, and whatever she saw in his face made her choose, for the moment, not to say the several things he could see she was prepared to say. "You can wait in the library," she said. "I'll wait here." "The library," Margaret said, in a tone that left no architecture for argument, "is where you will be when she asks for you. If she asks for you." She held his gaze. "My cousin does not need your guilt in the room while she's working. She needs to concentrate." He stood in the entrance hall of Dunmore while they carried Evelyn inside. She was walking, refusing the stretcher, one hand on the maid's arm, and her face set in the expression he now recognized as her bearing it without showing it face, the one she'd been wearing at the banquet, and at the inquiry office, and in every room of the mansion for 3 years while she carried things he hadn't known she was carrying. And he watched her go up the stairs without looking back at him. He went to the library. He didn't sit. He stood at the window with his forehead against the cold glass and watched the rain on the grounds, and thought about Harwick, who was currently in Crown custody, and Whitmore, who was currently in the hands of his own people, and who would shortly be in Crown custody as well, and the documentation that was now with the inquiry's senior oversight officer rather than Carvel, who was a mechanism rather than a man and could be left to process what he was given. He had managed all of that in the 4 hours between Evelyn's first contraction and departure. He was good at the mechanics of power. He had always been good at that. What he was not good at was the other thing, the thing that lived beyond the mechanics, in the territory where the people you were responsible for actually existed, where they had interior lives and breaking points, and the capacity to run out of patience with you in ways that couldn't be addressed by competence or authority or any of the tools he had. A sound reached him from somewhere in the house, not pain, something more fundamental, the deep physical work of a body doing the most demanding thing a body can do. He pressed his forehead harder against the glass. He had been in this library once before. Evelyn's family had hosted him the summer before the marriage, a formal visit, the kind of thing arranged by families rather than by people. And he had stood in almost this exact position at almost this exact window and looked at the grounds and thought, he remembered this with a clarity that surprised him. She's more than they've told me. He had watched her manage her family's complicated social dynamics for 3 days with a precision that looked like ease, and he had thought, she is considerably more than they've told me. He had been correct. He had then spent 3 years failing to act on that knowledge in any meaningful way. The door opened behind him. He turned. It was not Margaret. It was a young housemaid, barely 20, who was trying very hard not to look frightened of him. "The Duchess is asking for you, Your Grace." He was in the corridor before the sentence was finished. The east wing of Dunmore smelled like beeswax and the particular clean cold of a house that had been aired and then warmed quickly. The maid led him to a door at the far end of the passage and knocked once and opened it. Evelyn was in the bed, upright against a bank of pillows, with the midwife, a substantial woman in her 50s who looked at him with the frank, unimpressed assessment of someone who had been managing male relatives of laboring women for 30 years and had long since run out of patience with their more dramatic qualities. Positioned to the left. Margaret stood near the window. Evelyn looked exhausted in the way of someone who has been doing something enormous and is currently between the enormous parts. Her hair was loose, her color was wrong, too pale in some places, too high in others. Her hands were resting on top of the blanket, and she looked at him when he came in with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual. He had learned to read her face, but this was something he hadn't seen before, and it took him a moment to understand what it was. She was frightened. Not of labor, not of him, of what came after. He understood this in the specific way you understand things when it's too late to have understood them earlier, when understanding arrives not as illumination, but as inventory. She was frightened of what happened when this was over, of the shape of a future she hadn't finished deciding on, of the conversation she hadn't let herself have yet because there had always been something more urgent. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. "How are you?" he said, which was not what he meant to say, but was the only thing that came out. "Working on it," she said. A pause. "The contraction timing has been inconsistent. The midwife says it could be several more hours." He nodded. She looked at him. "Harwick. In custody. The Crown official who came to the house this morning. His name is Alderton. He's senior oversight. He has authority over Carvel and the formal inquiry. He has the documentation. He's already issued a temporary suspension of the charges pending review." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, "Whitmore. My people found him at the South Gate Inn. He's secured." A pause. "He was working for Harwick for 4 years. Not 2, not 1. 4. He said it flatly because there was no other way to say it. "Before I hired him back from my father's estate after the old man died. He was positioned." Something moved through her face. 4 years. Yes. She absorbed this. Another contraction was beginning. He could see it in the change of her breathing, the tightening of her hands on the blanket, the way she drew slightly inward and then made herself expand against it. He sat very still and did not offer to hold her hand because he had not yet earned the right to offer that, and he knew it. When it passed, she said very quietly, "I tried to tell you." "I know. I tried 3 times, not directly. I didn't have enough to bring you directly yet. But the Vermont letter question, the day you came back from Harwick's estate, I told you what had happened. I gave you what I had, and you said—" She stopped. "Tonight," he said. He made himself say it. "I said tonight. I wanted the documentation tonight." She looked at the ceiling. "Yes." I processed it as a problem to be managed. He heard the inadequacy of the words as he said them. "Because that's what I do. That's the only mechanism I've ever... I turn everything into a problem to be managed. People, threats, you." He looked at his hands. "You handed me a year of your life that night, and I treated it like a brief." The midwife was watching him with the frank expression of someone who has heard many bedside confessions and categorizes them quickly. He didn't care. "Adrian," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I'm not doing this now," she said. "I can't do this now. I'm in the middle of... I need to get through this first." "Of course." "I need you to stay," she said, and the word stay came out with a quality that told him it was not about the room, not about the next few hours, but about the larger geography of what came after, that she was asking something she wasn't ready to ask fully, in the only window she had before the work closed in again. "Just stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she always read him, completely, efficiently, without flattery or wishful interpretation. He let her. He had nothing to hide anymore. Whatever she found when she looked at him now was what was actually there. "Okay," she said. The next contraction arrived, harder than the last, and he sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and did not look away from her face. The daughter arrived at dusk. He heard her before he saw her, a sound that was nothing like anything he'd ever heard, a declaration rather than a cry, furious and specific and entirely sure of itself. The midwife worked. Margaret was there. He was in the corridor because he'd been moved there firmly when the final stage began, and he stood with his back against the wall and both hands pressed flat behind him against the plaster, and he waited. When Margaret opened the door, her face had that particular quality, the specific expression that appears on people who have witnessed something that recalibrates them, even when they've witnessed it before. Because some things never become ordinary, no matter how many times the world repeats them. "Evelyn is fine," Margaret said. "The baby is fine." A pause. "A girl." He closed his eyes. He stood in the corridor of Dunmore House in the winter dusk with his eyes closed and his hands flat against the wall, and he felt something move through him that he had no practice mechanism for. Not grief, not relief, but the specific, devastating weight of understanding arriving all at once, in a way the body processes before the mind catches up. He had almost lost both of them. He had spent 3 years building a fortress against everything external while the damage was being done internally, right at the center, by the one place he'd never thought to defend because he hadn't understood it needed defending. He had the duchy. He had the title. He had the mechanisms of power that he had inherited and maintained and extended with a consistency that had made other men afraid of him, and that he had, until very recently, considered a reasonable definition of success. He had never, until this moment, understood the specific poverty of that accounting. He went in. Evelyn was against the pillows, exhausted past the scale of what ordinary exhaustion means, holding a small wrapped bundle with the concentrated attention of someone doing the most important thing they have ever done. She didn't look up immediately when he came in. She was looking at the child. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at both of them and did not speak. After a moment, Evelyn looked up. She held his gaze. She looked at the child. She looked back at him. She held the bundle out. He crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed and took the weight of his daughter into his arms. Lighter than he'd expected, more solid than he'd expected, with a face that was doing something ancient and private. And he held her with the careful, slightly too rigid posture of a man who has never held an infant and is operating on instinct alone. The baby opened her eyes. Dark, like his. Already opinionated, already fixed on the middle distance with the focused intensity of something that has arrived fully committed to the project of existing. He looked at her for a long time. "What do we call her?" he said. His voice came out wrong, some rougher than he intended, lower. Evelyn was watching him. "I hadn't decided," she said. "I was waiting." A pause, so brief he almost missed it. "I thought you might want to say." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The thing between them, the accumulated damage of 3 years, the marble floor, the silence in the carriage, the tonight in the corridor, was still there. It was not resolved. Nothing that had broken would be repaired in a hospital room at dusk, or in a week, or in several months. And he was not the kind of man who would insult her by pretending otherwise. She was not the kind of woman who would let him. But she had held the child out. He held his daughter, and thought about the road and the rain and the 40 miles he'd driven on a bench because the inside of the carriage was the one place he had no function. And he thought, this is where it starts, not where it ends, starts. He was still thinking this when the door opened. Not Margaret, not the midwife. One of his own men, Garrett, who had been with him for 8 years, who only came himself when he couldn't send anyone else. His face was wrong, the face of a man who has ridden hard and is still deciding how to say what he's carrying. "Your Grace." A look at Evelyn, a look at the infant, a fractional hesitation. "I'm sorry for the interruption." Adrian looked at him. "Say it." Whitmore escaped custody an hour ago, the men securing him at the Southgate Inn. Garrett stopped, reorganized. He had help, someone inside. We don't know who yet. Another pause. He was seen heading toward the Dunmore Road. The room was very still. Adrian looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife, pale, exhausted, 8 hours past labor, in a house that had been prepared for comfort rather than defense, 40 miles from the capital on a road that Whitmore had traveled dozens of times as household secretary and knew in every detail. He stood up. He transferred the child to Evelyn with a careful, deliberate gentleness that was itself a kind of statement, something he was making himself finish before he did what came next. "Lock the house," he said to Garrett. "Every entrance, every ground floor window. Move the horses to the rear stable and have 2 men on the front road. He picked up his coat from the chair. "And get me a weapon." Eveline said his name. He turned. She was looking at him with the child in her arms and that expression on her face, the one he'd been learning to read, the one he'd spent 3 years being too armored to understand. And he waited. "Come back," she said. It was not a request. It was not a plea. It was something between a command and a promise, the kind of thing said by a person who has decided to believe in something they haven't finished deciding to believe in yet, said aloud because saying it aloud makes it a different kind of real. He looked at her for one long moment. "I'll come back," he said. He meant it in every way she had meant it. He went out into the dark. The dark outside Dunmore was the particular dark of deep country. No Capitol haze, no street lamps, just cloud cover pressing down on wet ground and the sound of rain that had finally begun to ease into something lighter, more uncertain, as though the storm itself was running out of conviction. Adrian moved along the east wall of the house with Garrett 3 steps behind him and 2 of his men flanking the rear garden. He had a pistol and a short blade and the specific quality of focus that descended on him in genuine emergencies, not the administrative focus of the study or the political focus of the council chamber, but something older and less managed, the kind that lived below the level of calculation. He had not used it in years. He had not needed to. His wars had all been conducted at tables, with documents, with the architecture of power as his primary instrument. Tonight was different. Whitmore knew this house. That was the core of it, the thing that made a fleeing man into a specific threat rather than a general one. He had traveled with the household party to Dunmore twice in 3 years, had managed the logistics of both visits, had walked every room and corridor as part of his role. He knew the East Wing layout. He knew which windows latched poorly. He knew that Eveline used the East Wing when she stayed here. The question was whether he was coming to destroy evidence, to take a hostage, or simply to finish what Harwick had started before the legal machinery closed around him completely. Adrian didn't know which. He moved as though all 3 were true simultaneously. Garrett touched his arm. At the corner of the garden wall, barely visible, a shape that was wrong, the wrong density against the dark, the wrong stillness of something trying not to move rather than something simply not moving. Adrian stopped. He watched. 30 seconds, 40. And then the shape shifted and became a man, and the man was moving toward the low window of the east corridor with the careful, practiced patience of someone who had thought this through. Adrian moved. He covered the ground between them without announcing himself, without the dramatic verbal warning that belongs to fiction rather than reality. Because in reality, men who have already decided to do something are not deterred by words, and the only language they respond to is the sudden physical fact of being stopped. He came in from the side and took Whitmore off his feet before the older man had registered his presence, and they went down hard into the wet ground together. And Whitmore was not a small man and was fighting with the particular desperation of someone who has run out of options, which made him more dangerous in the short term than he'd been in any of the long months of careful, patient betrayal. It was not a long struggle. Adrian was younger and had not been running for 2 hours in the rain, and the specific fury of a man protecting his family in the first hours of his daughter's life is not something that can be matched by the calculated desperation of a man who bet on the wrong side and is trying to avoid the consequence. When it was done, Whitmore was face down in the mud with Garrett's knee in his back and his hands secured, and Adrian stood over him with the rain on his face and his breathing rough and the fury still moving through him like current through wire, looking for somewhere to go. He looked down at Whitmore. The man had stopped struggling. He was lying still with his cheek against the wet ground, and there was something in his posture that was not surrender exactly, but the specific deflation of a person who has been carrying a tremendous weight for a very long time and has finally put it down, even though putting it down means the ground below is a cell. 9 years, Adrian said. Whitmore said nothing. 9 years in my household. You knew my father. You managed his estate in the last 2 years before he died. Adrian crouched down so he wasn't speaking at the ground. Was any of it real? A long pause. The rain tapped steadily on the garden stones. Some of it, Whitmore said. His voice was muffled by the ground and by something else. Not remorse exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been performing a version of himself for so long that he's no longer certain where the performance ends. The work was real, I'm good at the work. You're excellent at the work, Adrian said. That's what made you useful to them. Yes. What did they offer you? Another pause. My son has debts, the kind that don't get forgiven by ordinary means. Whitmore's voice was flat, factual, stripped of any bid for sympathy. Harwick offered to clear them 4 years ago. I said no twice. The third time he showed me what happened to people who said no. A breath. I'm not asking you to understand it. Good, Adrian said, because I don't. He stood up. He looked at the house. The east wing windows lit warmly against the dark, the small golden squares of light that meant Evelyn was in there with the child, with Margaret, with the midwife, all of them on the other side of the glass from this conversation in the wet ground. He thought about what Whitmore had just said. Some of it was real. He turned it over in his mind and found that it was possibly the most human thing the man had said in their entire acquaintance, and also possibly the saddest. That a person could spend 9 years doing real work with real skill in service of something false, and those two things could both be completely true at the same time. That the work and the betrayal could coexist in the same body without either canceling the other out. He understood something, crouching in the rain outside the house where his daughter had just been born, that he had spent years successfully avoiding understanding, that people were not either trustworthy or untrustworthy, not either loyal or corrupt, not either the ally they presented or the enemy they concealed. They were the full weight of what life had pressed them into, and the accounting of that weight was rarely simple and never finished, and the mistake was not in trusting Whitmore. The mistake was in the particular brand of trust he'd offered, the kind that doesn't pay attention, that outsources its vigilance to the trusted party themselves, and then is surprised when that party is compromised. He had trusted Whitmore the way he'd trusted Evelyn, completely, unverifyingly, as a fixed fact about the world that required no maintenance. The difference was that Evelyn had been worthy of it. Get him up, he said to Garrett. Capital, tonight. I want him in front of Alderton before morning. Mutt. He went back inside. The east wing was quieter now. The midwife had finished her work, Margaret had withdrawn to let Evelyn rest, and the room, when he pushed the door open, was lit by a single lamp turned low and the banked warmth of a fire that had been tended carefully through the evening. Evelyn was awake. He'd expected her to be asleep. She should have been asleep. Her body had been through a war, and sleep was the only rational response. But she was awake, and the child was in the cradle beside the bed, and she was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who hasn't yet decided whether they're done thinking. He came in and closed the door and stood for a moment just inside it. It's handled, he said. Garrett is taking him to the Capitol. She nodded. She didn't ask for details. She would want them eventually. She would want every detail, in the particular thorough way she processed information, and he would give them to her. But not tonight. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at the cradle. The child was asleep in the absolute committed way of newborns. Not the light provisional sleep of adults, but something deeper. Something that trusts the world completely, because it hasn't yet accumulated reasons not to. One small fist was raised near her face. Her breathing was even and indifferent and entirely sure of itself. She looks like she's already decided something, he said. Evelyn made a sound, not quite a laugh, the nearest thing to it that exhaustion allowed. She's been decided since the 3rd month. I could tell. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cecily. Evelyn turned her head to look at him. What? For her name. He looked at the cradle. If you want it, Cecily was my grandmother's name. She was the only person in my family she was difficult in a way that was actually useful rather than just difficult. A pause. She would have liked you. Evelyn looked at the child for a long time. Cecily, she said, trying the weight of it. You don't have to. No, she said. It's good. She settled it somewhere internally, the way he'd watched her settle things, quickly, completely, without lingering. Cecily. The fire shifted, the lamp threw its small, steady circle. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and the silence left behind was the clean, particular silence of weather finally finished. Adrian looked at his hands. He had been building toward this specific moment, this room, this conversation, since the study, since the corridor outside her bedroom door, since the carriage ride where she'd looked at the rain-tracked window and he'd said, "Get some rest." And she had understood, finally and conclusively, that he was not going to become someone different just because she waited long enough. He had known this conversation was coming, and he had not prepared a speech for it because prepared speeches were what he offered when he wanted to manage an outcome, and the one thing he was not permitted to do here was manage the outcome. So he simply said what was true. "I spent 3 years being afraid of what it meant to actually need you," he said. "Not afraid of you. Afraid of what needing you would cost me in terms of the version of myself I'd built." He looked at her. "I decided a long time ago that needing things was a liability, that the safest version of strength was the kind that could function without depending on anything it couldn't directly control." A pause. "You can't control love. You can't manage it like a duchy. I knew that, and I built the walls higher because of it." Evelyn was watching him. "What happened at the banquet?" he said. "I need you to know that I understood, in the moment, what I was choosing. I told myself I was following protocol, that it was politically necessary, that addressing it privately afterward was the more sophisticated response. All of that was true, and none of it was the real reason." He looked at the cradle. "The real reason was that stopping it would have required me to choose you publicly over the court's expectation of me, and I was not yet willing to pay that cost." He said it cleanly, without softening. "That is the true account. I don't want to give you a better version." The fire was very quiet. "I know," Evelyn said. "I knew then. I know you knew." "That's what broke it," she said. "Not the kneeling, not the pain of it. The fact that you knew too, and did it anyway." She looked at the ceiling again. "I could have forgiven confusion. I could have forgiven you believing them over me, even that. But you didn't believe them over me. You assessed the cost and made a choice, and I was the thing you chose to spend." She said it without anger. The anger had burned through her long ago, somewhere in the 11 months of quiet work, and what was left on the other side of it was something colder and more honest. "I spent 3 years making myself invisible to protect you, not because you asked me to, because I understood what you were facing and I loved you enough to do it without a contract." A pause. "And you never once looked." He didn't flinch from it. He had decided, somewhere on the bench of that carriage in the rain, that the thing he owed her above everything else was the willingness to hear the true account of what he'd done without retreating into justification. A man who could not hold the weight of his own failures without converting them into something more comfortable was a man who hadn't actually changed, who had simply identified a new crisis to manage. He held the weight. "No," he said, "I didn't." She turned her head and looked at him, and whatever she was reading in his face, whatever assessment she was running, the same complete and unsparing inventory she'd been taking of him for 3 years, he let her take it, all of it, the full scope. "Why now?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He thought about it. He could have said it was Cecily, or the 40 miles in the rain, or the moment in the study when she'd said, "I tried to tell you," with the specific flatness of someone reporting a fact they've accepted rather than a wound they're still bleeding from. All of those were true. But the truest thing was simpler and less flattering. "Because I ran out of the ability to believe the walls were worth what they cost," he said. "Not because I became a better man overnight. Because the accounting finally came due and I couldn't make the numbers work anymore." He looked at her. "That's not heroic. I'm aware of that." She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said, "but it's honest." A breath. "I spent 3 years wanting you to be honest more than I wanted you to be heroic. Honest was always the thing I couldn't get." The lamp flickered once and steadied. In the cradle, Cecily slept with her fist raised and her face doing its ancient private calculations, entirely unconcerned with the conversation happening beside her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," Adrian said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. You gave birth 8 hours ago, and I showed up to your safe house with a fugitive on the grounds, and that is not the beginning I owe you." He looked at his hands. "I'm asking you to let me try. Not a performance of trying, not gifts or apologies managed from a distance. I want to be in the room, every room, For as long as it takes for you to see whether what I'm offering is real or whether it's another wall dressed up differently." She was quiet for so long that he thought she might have simply decided not to answer tonight, which was her right and which he would respect. Then she said, "I will not kneel for anyone again. Not the court, not a protocol, not you on one of your bad days when the pressure makes you cold. That is not available anymore." "I know. And I will not work in silence. If I know something that concerns this household or this duchy, I will say it directly and you will hear it, not file it. Yes. And if you close down, if I see the walls going up because something's gotten too close, I will say so. I will not wait it out." She looked at him steadily. "Those are not requests. They're the terms of what I'm willing to rebuild." He held her gaze. "Those are fair." "They're the minimum," she said, "not the goal." "What's the goal?" She looked at the cradle. She looked back at him. And for the first time since the banquet, since before the banquet, since the months of careful, invisible protection, since the long accumulation of silences that had been taken for contentment, something in her face unlocked. Not warmth yet, not forgiveness, not the full restoration of something broken, but the beginning of the willingness to look at the possibility of it. "I want Cecily to grow up watching her parents choose each other," she said. "Not perform for the court, not manage a dynasty, not coexist strategically, actually choose. So she grows up knowing that's what love looks like, not the version the court sees, the real one." Her voice was quiet and entirely serious. "That's the goal." He looked at his daughter in the cradle. The raised fist, the absolute sleep, the complete unapologetic existence of a person who had arrived into the world and immediately claimed all of it. "Then that's what we build," he said. 6 months later, the inquiry had completed its work. Harwick was stripped of his title and his properties by Crown decree. A public proceeding that lasted 4 days and drew every significant noble family in the kingdom to the capital, because the scale of what the documentation revealed had reached beyond one man's ambition into the structural corruption of the Interior Council itself. 3 other nobles lost their seats. The Crown restructured the council's oversight apparatus using recommendations that had been drafted, in significant part, by the Duchess of Blackthorn, whose 11 months of primary source investigation had provided the foundational architecture of the entire case. She had not done it quietly. That was the change that the court noticed first. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but unmistakable. The Duchess of Blackthorn, who had been characterized by her composure and her silence and her precise, invisible management of things behind the scenes, had begun to occupy her space differently. She attended the inquiry sessions directly. She answered questions with the specific, documented confidence of someone who had earned every word. She did not defer to her husband's presence in the room. They arrived together and functioned as a unit, but she did not position herself behind him, and he did not position himself in front of her, and the court recalibrated around this the way courts recalibrate around power, which is to say, quickly and without acknowledgement of the adjustment. Whitmore received a sentence proportional to the information he provided, which was considerable. He had not in the end been primarily motivated by ideology or ambition. He had been motivated by a debt and a threat and the specific human failure of choosing to protect one thing by destroying another. Adrian had given that accounting more thought than he'd expected to in the months after, not because it exonerated Whitmore, but because it complicated the simple story of villain and victim in ways that felt more true to the actual texture of how damage happened between people who occupied the same close space. Most damage did not arrive as betrayal. It arrived as small choices, accumulated, that each seemed survivable on their own. He had made enough of those choices himself to understand the mechanism. The evening of the final inquiry decree, Adrian and Evelyn stood in the main gallery of Ashford Hall. Same hall, same chandeliers, the same proportions that had held 500 people on the night everything had broken, now holding perhaps 200 for what the court had termed a ceremonial acknowledgement of the inquiry's conclusion, a formal occasion, the kind the kingdom used to publicly recalibrate its understanding of who held what kind of standing. Evelyn was in deep green. Cecily was at Dunmore with Margaret, who had been informed in some detail about what was expected of her care, and who had rolled her eyes and said she'd been keeping children alive since before Evelyn could walk, which was Margaret's way of saying, of course, "Go, I have this." Adrian stood beside his wife in front of the assembled court and looked at the room. He thought about the last time. He thought about the specific place on the marble where she had knelt, about the quality of the silence in the hall, about the expression on his face that he could not see at the time, but that he had been able to reconstruct with terrible precision afterward. The careful, sealed neutrality of a man who had decided that what was happening was acceptable because the alternative required something he wasn't willing to give. He stepped away from Evelyn. She turned to look at him, uncertain. A rare thing, that uncertainty on her face, and it registered in him the way anything real registered now, which was fully, without the old reflex to file it away. He faced her. In front of the assembled court of the Blackthorn Duchy, in the same gallery where she had been forced to her knees while carrying his child, Adrian Blackthorn lowered himself to one knee. The hall went the kind of quiet that is something more than silence. The absolute suspension of a room collectively holding its breath, 500 people processing something that had no precedent in their experience of this man. He looked up at her. "I failed to protect you," he said. His voice carried without effort in the silent hall. "I failed to see what you were carrying. I failed to choose you when the cost of choosing you was visible to everyone in this room." He held her gaze. "I am asking you publicly, in the same room where I allowed that to happen, to accept my word that I understand the full weight of what I owe you, not as a performance, as a record." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough for the hall to remain in its suspended quiet, long enough for every person watching to understand that this was not choreography, that whatever she decided in this moment was genuinely undecided and genuinely hers to decide. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, completely, without flattery, with the full and unsparing attention of a woman who had never once mistaken what she wanted for what was actually there. She had been protecting him for so long that it had become the shape of how she loved him, and she had needed to learn. In the months since Dunmore, in the slow, careful work of rebuilding something from its actual foundations rather than its preferred surfaces, that protection and love were not the same thing. That love, real love, was not the management of another person's blind spots. It was the willingness to stand beside them while they learned to see. She had been learning that. So had he. She extended her hand. He took it. He rose. And the hall, the same marble, the same chandeliers burning over the same gathered court, bowed, not to him, to her. The movement began at the front tables and traveled outward the way things traveled in that room, in waves, until the full gallery was inclined toward the Duchess of Blackthorn with the specific gravity of a court acknowledging something that has been overdue. She looked out at them. She looked at Adrian beside her. "That," she said very quietly, so only he could hear, "is the beginning." "I know," he said. She kept hold of his hand. Dog. A year after that, Cecily Blackthorn took her first steps in the music room of the Blackthorn mansion, lurching, determined, furious at the uncooperativeness of her own legs, deeply committed to the project regardless. She crossed 6 feet of floor between her father's hands and her mother's, fell once, registered this as unacceptable information, and immediately tried again. Evelyn was at the piano in the evenings again. Not every evening. She had too much else in the hours after dinner now. Correspondence and council work, and the ongoing reconstruction of the duchy's interior oversight that kept both of them occupied well past the hours when the household went quiet. But she played when the work was done, and the music room filled with it, and the mansion that had once been designed to signal power without warmth now had warmth moving through it the way light moves through imperfect glass. Imperfectly, with edges, but genuinely, all the way through. Adrian sat in the doorway of the music room on a January evening and listened to his wife play and watched his daughter sleep in the small chair she'd claimed as her personal territory, and thought about what it cost, and what it was worth, and whether those two things were ever actually separable. He had been a man who believed that power was its own justification, that the accumulation of strength was the point, that what you built was the measure of what you were. He had built well. The duchy was prosperous, the conspirators were dismantled, the mechanisms of his authority were intact and considerably more honest than they'd been before the year that had broken everything open. But what had actually changed in him was not the duchy. What had changed was the capacity to be in a room without needing to be the most armored thing in it, to listen without filing, to let someone else's pain arrive without immediately converting it into a problem to be solved, to hold the weight of what he had done and had failed to do without retreating into either self-flagellation or justification, but simply with the steady, unglamorous discipline of a man who had decided that accountability was not a one-time event, but a permanent practice. He did not find this easy. He was not constitutionally a man built for this kind of sustained effort. He was built for the decisive action, the clear problem, the moment where strength and will were directly applicable. The slower, more demanding work of becoming someone worthy of the trust he'd been given, that was new territory, and new territory is always harder than the maps suggest. But Cecily had looked at him that morning from her small, claimed chair with the complete, undiluted attention of a child who has not yet learned to read faces for danger, whose entire relationship with him was built on a foundation that hadn't been there for her mother, and she had offered him a piece of her breakfast with the casual, royal confidence of someone distributing gifts. He had taken it. The music filled the room. Evelyn played without looking at him, but her shoulders had the particular quality of awareness that meant she knew he was there, had known since he sat down, was choosing to continue rather than stop. And that choice, repeated evening after evening in the imperfect working light of a life being rebuilt, was the thing that deserved to be called what it was. It was not forgiveness completed. It was forgiveness in progress, which was the only honest version of forgiveness there was. He stayed in the doorway until the music ended. Then Evelyn turned on the bench and looked at him across the room, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying right now, and learning when nothing needed saying had been its own difficult lesson. She reached over and turned the lamp up. The light pushed the dark back to the edges of the room, where it belonged.